For more than a century, the United States has been the world's biggest economy, accounting for over 24% of the world's gross domestic product or GDP in 2020, according to figures from the World Bank. But change is afoot. Both International Monetary Fund and the World Bank now rate China as the world's largest economy based on purchasing power parity, a measure that adjusts countries' GDPs for differences in prices. In simple terms, this means that because your money stretches further in China than it would in the US, China's GDP is adjusted upwards. And it won't be too long before China's economy surpasses the US's by other measures, too. The Center for Economics and Business Research predicts it will happen in 2029. However, in order to surpass the US's highly diversified, tertiary economy, there's more to do. China still needs to make the all-important transition from a resource-intensive manufacturing hub to a modern, consumer-driven economy. So, what happened to the US and China in the last 2 decades? Let's figure out the trajectory development of both countries. There were 2 events in late 2001 that shook the axis of the world. The US encountered the largest attack in its history since the Pearl Harbor incident in 1941, known as September 11 attacks, also called 9/11 attacks. On September 11, 2001, 19 militants associated with the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 airplanes and carried out suicide attacks against targets in the US. 2 of the planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, a 3rd plane hit the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., and the 4th plane crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 people were killed during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which triggered major U.S. initiatives to combat terrorism.
What's that? Somebody hit the World Trade Center or
It's a trade center.
Our fellow citizens, our way of life, in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Of the Pentagon.
Now this is
a so-called war on terror had been declared. It has since led to the invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq, to the rise of ISIS and the proliferation of Iranian-backed militias across the Middle East. America's attention abruptly shifted to the war on terror. In June 2011, then-President Barack Obama announced the beginning of large-scale troop withdrawals from Afghanistan. It took until August 2021 for all U.S. forces to withdraw. Nearly 20 years since the war was declared in 2001. On December 18, 2011, the last U.S. soldiers leave Iraq, ending a nearly 9-year military mission.
After taking office, I announced a new strategy that would end our combat mission in Iraq and remove all of our troops by the end of 2011.
It was also in 2011 that another major event occurred, when the U.S. war in Afghanistan was in full swing. Exactly 3 months later, on December 11, China officially joined the World Trade Organization, or WTO. China wanted to join the WTO because it would allow China access to new trading partners and better rates with current ones, raising prospects for improved living standards domestically and giving China a seat at the table in a globalizing world. The U.S. wanted something too, for China to get on board with a U.S.-led, liberal democratic order and move away from its communist model. But that's not quite what happened. Former U.S. President Bill Clinton even boasted that by joining the WTO, China was agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom. The U.S. thought it was directing the show when China acceded to the WTO. Instead, China wrote its own script.
For the first time, China will agree to play by the same open trading rules we do. Never happened before. For the first time, our companies will be able to sell and distribute products in China made by workers here in America.
For China, its entry into the global trading tent was a huge success that helped raise millions of workers out of poverty and propelled its economy from the world's 6th to the 2nd largest. From 1990 to 2015, the share of the Chinese population living in extreme poverty, defined as living on less than $1.90 a day, declined from 67% to under 1%. China's economy is 11 times larger than it was in 2001. Trade in goods between the United States and China increased from less than $100 billion in 1999 to $558 billion in 2019. China surpassed Germany to become the world's largest exporter in 2009. Though the world's consumers benefited from an influx of cheap Chinese goods, there's now a growing view in the US and Europe that China's WTO accession was a historic, job-killing mistake. China's gross domestic product jumped from $1.2 trillion in 2000 to more than $14.7 trillion in 2020. While US was busy fighting wars, China was busy trading. As the US was bogged down fighting Islamist militants in Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere, China's economic and military power grew exponentially. Beijing built up its missile arsenal, extended its reach in the South China Sea by constructing artificial islands, stole intellectual property on a massive scale and pursued predatory trade tactics. The 9/11 attacks did not alter China's goals, but that they created the chance to close the gap with a rival distracted by the war on terror. The US spent an estimated $8 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and on other fronts in the fight against terrorism, according to a report by the Costs of War Project at Brown University. In early 2001, when President George Bush came to power, what was the state of the United States budget left by his predecessor, Bill Clinton? Clinton had budget surpluses for fiscal years 1998 until 2001. His final year budget was balanced budget with surplus. But after the two war, when President George Bush stepped down in 2009, although GDP has grown year by year, the US had returned to the state of annual deficits in the pasts. More importantly, in the end of 2007, another major event happened, and that was the 2008 financial crisis. The Great Recession began well before 2008. The first signs came in 2006 when housing prices began falling. Too big to fail banks, hedge funds, and insurance firms found themselves holding worthless investments. Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy. By August 2007, the Federal Reserve responded to the subprime mortgage crisis by adding $24 billion in liquidity to the banking system. The stock market crashed in 2008. The Dow registered one of the largest point drops in history. By September 2008, Congress approved a $700 billion bank bailout, now known as the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Unemployment reached 10% in 2009. By February 2009, President Obama proposed the $787 billion economic stimulus package, which helped avert a global depression. Now, the United States is facing massive current deficits. Before 2008, the Fed's budget deficit never exceeded $1 trillion mark, but because of financial crisis, serial of policy actions adopted tax cuts and spending increases. Then, in 2009, the bottom fell out. So, what happened to China in 2008? 2008 is year of distress and glory for China. On May 2008, a massive earthquake hit Sichuan province, killing tens of thousands. On the same year, Beijing successfully hosts one of the grandest Olympic Games in the history of the world in August. While China did not suffer a Western-style financial crisis, it was hit hard by the second-order effects, as exports suddenly collapsed. China's economy relies hugely on exporting their goods overseas, and when American households lost about $16 trillion of net worth in the recession, they couldn't afford to buy as many imported goods from China. In 2007, the growth rate of exports was 25.7%, exports made up 36% of GDP and China's GDP growth rate was 13%. In the first quarter of 2009, China's growth rate fell further to 6.1%. The real estate market in several Chinese cities has exhibited signs of a bubble that is bursting. The value of China's main stock market index lost nearly two-thirds of its value. About 20 million migrant workers alone had lost their jobs. On November 9, 2008, China introduced a 4 trillion renminbi, or equal to $584 billion stimulus package, to be put into infrastructure and social welfare programs by 2010. Both China and the US had embarked on stimulus efforts in late 2008 and 2009. A year later, though, China's economy seemed to be back on track, while the US was still stuck. Why did China recover so fast, given its export-driven growth model, while the rest of the world didn't? The answer lies in the response of the Chinese government and one-party system with the control necessary to push through stringent domestic policies, even if they caused short-term pain for its already struggling firms. China's stimulus package was comparable in size to the US stimulus packages, but it came from an economy about one-third the size at the time, so the effect was more drastic and the initiative much bolder than any other country dared to enact. The US enacted programs with similar goals, so why did China's work while the US didn't? The difference was largely influenced by the Chinese government's control of the economy. China has a market authoritarian system where the government can keep a much closer handle on any economic activity in their country. In the US, there is a much less restrictive free market system, and firms are under less pressure to do anything for the good of the country, instead focusing on minimizing profit loss. Once the Great Recession hit, American firms were hesitant to borrow and invest in expanding operations when aggregate demand was still low, and consumers weren't willing to spend when firms weren't hiring. In China, this wasn't the case. They had things like state-owned enterprises run by the government, and the government took rapid steps to help the country even though they incurred debt and loss in the short run. China surpasses Japan as the world's second-largest economy after it is valued at $1.33 trillion for the second quarter of 2010, slightly above Japan's $1.28 trillion for that year. Dollar rate has increased since July 2014. The dollar is strong for few reasons. First, the Fed took two actions. It ended its expansive monetary policy as the economy continued to improve following the Great Recession. This constrained the supply of the dollar, which had the effect of increasing its value. Second, the Fed also raised interest rates in December 2015, which strengthened the value of the dollar further. China's slowing economy is one reason why the dollar gained strength in 2014 and 2015. China directly pegs its yuan to the dollar. As the world's second-largest economy, the Chinese market, economy, and currency influence the US dollar immensely. China manages its currency to control the prices of its exports. It wants to make sure its exports cost less than other products when sold in the US. So a weaker yuan against the US dollar would generally make Chinese goods exported to the US cheaper, increasing demand, while making US exports to China more expensive, reducing demand. As a result, the US trade deficit would likely widen. A stronger yuan against the US dollar would have the opposite effect. In 2015 also, the US, Japan and 10 other countries concluded negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP, the largest regional trade accord in history, and one that does not include China. While many experts say the TPP had economic and strategic benefits, it drew attacks from across the US political spectrum. President Trump withdrew from the deal on his first day in office.
Great thing for the American worker, what we just
For
did.
its part, Beijing pushed a separate trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership or RCEP, which includes 15 Asia-Pacific countries, but not the US. The RCEP was signed in November 2020. It also launched its Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to develop trade and energy infrastructure throughout South and Central Asia. After Trump withdrew from the TPP, the remaining 11 signatories, known as the TPP 11, continued talks with the aim of salvaging a pact without the US. Their effort was successful, leading to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, which was signed in March 2018. On September 2021, China applied to join the CPTPP, potentially bringing Beijing into a pact that was initially designed to counter it. So, RCEP, one of the world's largest trade blocs along with the CPTPP, is a sign that the countries in the region are moving on without the US. Both mega agreements are going to lead to more integration between the members. In early of 2018, President Trump began to launch the trade war to pressure Beijing to implement significant changes to aspects of its economic system that facilitate unfair Chinese trade practices.
They take our money, they take our jobs, and we owe them $1.6 trillion.
Between July 2018 and August 2019, the U.S. announced plans to impose tariffs on more than $550 billion of Chinese products, and China retaliated with tariffs on more than $185 billion of U.S. goods. The trade war caused economic pain on both sides and led to diversion of trade flows away from both China and the U.S. U.S. economic growth slowed, business investment froze, and companies didn't hire as many people. Across the nation, a lot of farmers went bankrupt, and the manufacturing and freight transportation sectors have hit lows not seen since the last recession. It should be noted that, while the U.S. deficit with China decreased, its overall trade deficit did not. Trump's unilateral tariffs on China diverted trade flows from China, causing the U.S. trade deficit with Europe, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to increase as a result. China also felt economic pain as a result of the trade war, though apparently not enough to capitulate to the Trump administration's core demands for major structural reform. Indeed, as the trade war dragged on, Beijing lowered its tariffs for its other trading partners as it reduced its reliance on U.S. markets. China exports more goods to the U.S. than to any other country in the world, and those exports have dropped by more than 12% in 2019. That drop has clearly hit the Chinese manufacturing sector. Industrial output growth in China fell to its lowest level in 17 years. A Phase 1 trade deal was signed in January 2020, although relations have not significantly improved under the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden. At the end of 2019, an outbreak of COVID-19 emerged in Wuhan, China. The virus rapidly spread across China and the rest of the world. To curb the spread of the virus, the Chinese government imposed a lockdown in Wuhan, the epicenter, and other cities in Hubei province on January 23, 2020. A strict nationwide lockdown soon followed. In the first quarter of 2020, the second-largest economy recorded the first contraction, i.e. 6.8% in decades due to the epidemic. Strict virus containment measures and emergency relief for businesses helped the economy recover. The economy grew 2.3% in 2020, despite COVID-19 shutdowns, causing output to slump in early 2020. As China managed to bring the COVID-19 pandemic under control, economic growth recovered quickly. According to a median projection in October 2021, China's GDP was expected to grow by 8.2% in 2021. The National Bureau of Economic Research declared that a recession had started in early 2020, as U.S. GDP declined by 5.1% in the first quarter of 2020, then contracted a record 31.4% in the second quarter, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. U.S. economy shrank 3.5% in 2020. The recession was largely caused by government-ordered shutdowns to slow the spread of the outbreak. It ended the longest economic expansion in U.S. history. The entertainment, retail, and hospitality industries were hit the hardest. After the initial outbreak, other businesses began learning how to reopen safely. The Federal Reserve predicts that growth will improve to a robust 4.2% in 2021 once a vaccine has been widely distributed. There's no question that overall, U.S. is still today a more successful society and ahead of China in many areas. China should never underestimate U.S. However, it would be an equally big mistake for U.S. to underestimate China. At the end of the day, what most of humanity would like to see is a rational understanding and a rational discourse between the world's two leading powers, U.S. and China. It's the best weapon the Biden administration can use to build a new relationship with China, with the right balance of competition and cooperation.
As I've said before, it seems to me our responsibility as leaders of China and the United States to ensure that the competition between our countries does not veer into conflict, whether intended or unintended.